And we should keep in mind that the Chinese military in 2015, 2016 reorganized, and they created the Strategic Support Force specifically to put space and cyber together, because when they look at their challenge, mainly the United States, those are two sides of the same coin. If you can use cyber to cut off your space access, it doesn't matter how cool your satellites are.
From the Defense and Aerospace Report, this is The Downlink, a podcast about the intersection of space, the space business, and defense. Not just what's over the horizon, but what's happening above it. I'm your host, Laura Winter. Hello again, Downlink listeners. This episode was intended to be the fourth and final episode of a month-long series looking at the space industrial base. The focus was supposed to be on China's space industry, but then there was some curious news. The New York Times reported that U.S. intelligence agencies and Microsoft discovered that a Chinese state-sponsored hacker group called Typhoon installed some mysterious code on the computer networks of Guam's telecommunications systems and critical infrastructure. So here's the connection to defense. You see, Guam is a U.S. territory in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It's closer to Taiwan than Hawaii. It's about 1/5 the size of the state of Rhode Island, and it's where you'll find Andersen Air Force Base, U.S. Naval Base Guam, and the Marines' newly established Camp Blas. There are roughly 22,000 Americans in uniform there. It's even got a pier for nuclear-powered submarines. You can think of this sovereign strip of land like a forward operating base that the U.S. uses to project military power into the Far East. It also just got hit this week by Typhoon Mawar. Now, the Air Force Base and the Navy base both have satellite telecommunication systems, and the Guam Tracking Station, which the U.S. Space Force operates for commanding and controlling satellites. I reached out to the U.S. Space Command, the U.S. Space Force, the Space Operations Command, and the Defense Information Systems Agency. While I have communicated with some very nice public affairs officers, none have been able to confirm or deny whether or not this mysterious hacker code from China is present in Department of Defense satellite telecommunication systems. So I got together with two of the best China, space, and U.S. military experts I know, Chris Stone and Brendan Mulvaney, to talk about Typhoon, China's intentions, and the current state of play in U.S. military space policy. Here's our conversation. Hi, Chris, Brendan. It's been way too long since you two were last on the podcast.
Hi, how are you? Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, super excited. It has been a while, so it's good to be back doing this.
Thanks, Chris. I have to say it's great to be back as well, because last week I was in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I have to say I have been missing my own bed for some time. So before we get started today, we need to do some introductions. And Chris, why don't you start?
Sure. I am Christopher Stone. I am Senior Fellow for Space Deterrence Studies at the National Institute for Deterrence Studies in Washington, D.C., and I'm a former special assistant for a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy, and I've been working space policy and strategy for nearly 20 years, and looking forward to the discussion.
And Brendan?
So I'm Brendan Mulvaney. Currently, I am the director of the United States Air Force's China Aerospace Studies Institute. Before that, I was in the Marine Corps for 25 years as a Cobra pilot, and I lived in and studied at the Fudan University in Shanghai, China. That's how I came to the China beat.
And haven't you just come back from Japan? I mean, yeah. What were you doing there? And I mean, like, just come back from Japan, like you just dropped your bags at the door.
Yep, literally right off the airplane and right back here. So, no, we had a couple weeks of meetings with our Japanese counterparts. We really went all over Tokyo and had some great meetings. We met with the National Institute of Defense Studies. We went with the 7th Air Wing. We met with several other people, Camp Zama. And like I said, just working on the alliance, trying to figure out how we can help them and how we can do research together on Chinese aerospace writ large. So it was a fantastic trip, really busy, but very rewarding.
Oh, come on. Did you meet with anybody who does anything with space? This is a space
That's
podcast.
true. We were very fortunate. So in the small world that is the JASDAF, we happen to know the current commander of the Japanese Space Operations Group. Then that just got stood up about a year and a half, 2 years ago, and so we went. That was a little bit of a, Tokyo is a massive city, so it was still in Tokyo, but hour and a half to get to the other side of Tokyo. But went out to Space Ops Group. We got the in brief from them. We met the staff. We got to go down and see their Space Situational Awareness Center, and actually, I had a great visit with them, and it's really impressive how far they've come so fast. So, and they're continuing to grow and hopefully continue to leverage the increase in budget that the JASDAF and the self defense forces in general is getting. So,
Yeah, it's
we were very
supposed to
fortunate.
double
We were
in like
there.
5 years, isn't it?
Yeah, it's fantastic. So they went from a handful of people and no building to dozens of people and a building and an SSA, and now they're going to have two sites. And in fact, General Uchikura was there visiting about 2 hours before we got there. So definitely getting some good highlights.
All right, now, well, I initially brought you guys back on the podcast to talk about the latest in space in China. There's a bit of news that's bubbling up and has the potential to be quite big, and that's the Volt Typhoon cyber intrusion. Now, the New York Times' David Sanger broke the story, and he reports that a mysterious computer code has been found to be appearing in telecommunication systems in Guam and elsewhere in the United States. Now, Guam is 212 square miles, and it's in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, roughly 4,000 miles west of Hawaii. And because it's a U.S. territory, it also is home to Andersen Air Force Base, the Guam Tracking Station, and a variety of satellite communication systems used by the Air Force and the Navy, which also has a base there. So when I take all of this together, and that's just me, the military installations, the remoteness of the island, the fact that Sanger writes about telecommunications, my first thought instinctually goes to satellite telecommunications, which includes, computers and a ground segment. So, gentlemen, besides cell phone service, what is the telecommunications infrastructure mix on Guam? Is this, Volt Typhoon thing something space related or not?
All right, I'll jump in. Guam, as you mentioned, an important location for the Air Force and the Navy. Although obviously a long ways from places, they do have fiber, right? So there are undersea cables that are running there, and obviously a lot of it goes through space, as you would imagine, both civilian and military. So there's a full mix on Guam. It's a pretty busy place, looking to grow in importance in the coming years. So I've only read what's out there publicly available in the article you mentioned and other things, but it does look like it's a software code that, depending on how it gets implemented, could in fact affect a range of telecommunications there on Guam. So, and I think that's really why it was so important, because of the breadth of the depth of the penetration and the breadth of the things that it could impact.
I'll just jump in and add. I think one of the other things that caught my attention in the articles was the phrase critical infrastructure. And the reason why is because one of the few things that was really pretty good about the space priorities framework is that it mentions that the space infrastructure in orbit and on the ground is pretty well linked into critical infrastructure, both of a defense variety and a societal economic variety. And so because of Guam being a pretty large hub in the Pacific for the United States and even some of its allies and partners, for both the ability to communicate and command and control forces, to just standard communications across the pond, if you will. Because of that, and I think it is a good thing to be concerned about, especially as they mentioned, pipelines and things of that sort that could possibly be taken down, which are linked to GPS and other things for timing signals and things of that sort. But at the same time, I mean, this stuff is just part of, unfortunately, what we get to deal with in this time, and if you guys remember, I think it was 2021 or so when the Russians, I believe it was, hacked into one of our pipelines on the East Coast and pretty much locked up a lot of the economy, created a price increase that was crazy. Just sort of just to get everybody's attention that this is something that can happen and happen fairly easily. So it's a lot of work to defend against these things, and I'm happy to see that they've announced it so it's not a surprise to people.
Both of you know Chinese strategy, and this mysterious code, at least according to the reports, seems to be something of an espionage operation. To understand how some U.S. critical infrastructures work, what do you think the intent here is? I mean, it was actually found, and a lot of times this stuff isn't found. And if it is found, some people have proffered to me that it's actually a signal that's, telling us that perhaps we can't be sure about our telecommunications systems. What do you guys think of that? Is there a message here?
I don't know about that. These intrusions happen every day. Again, some are found, some are not, some are publicized, some are not. I think it was great that, this one was just to kind of illustrate to people the nature of the challenge that we faced and the fact that, people different countries act differently in cyber ways, right? North Korea uses cyber to steal billions of dollars to keep their missile program going. The Russians kind of like to go in and try to break things. The Chinese tend to be, and obviously there's overlapping of all these, but the Chinese tend to be more for espionage and systems analysis to understand how things work. And we should keep in mind that the Chinese military in 2015, 2016 reorganized and they created the Strategic Support Force specifically to put space and cyber together because when they look at their challenge, mainly the United States, those are two sides of the same coin. If you can use cyber to cut off your space access, it doesn't matter how cool your satellites are. And the same is the reverse is true, right? If you can use space, you can cut off space. Well, that is going to have a huge impact on cyber because, like you led off with, Guam is a long way away from anything. And a lot of our cyber capabilities rely on space communications. And that's specifically why I'm not saying the SSF had anything to do with this particular one, but that's, the Chinese mindset. That's exactly why they created the SSF in the first place. So it would make sense that across the Chinese system, that's kind of their outlook.
Yeah, and I would also add the fact that, as you mentioned, Brendan, with the importance of space for the Chinese and their understanding of space to be a vulnerability, a critical vulnerability of ours that they can exploit and hopefully slow down not only terrestrial response operations and communications, but also space operations that give us advantages and things that we rely so much upon. And when I was reading through this, the thing that came into my mind was their concept of system destruction, where they, instead of just focusing on one missile shot or some laser shots and even a multi-layered attack architecture, as they like to say that they have in the space and counter space world, but as seen with Starlink and some of the reports that have come out about their view of that they're basically doing what I think is nodal analysis of sorts. They're looking for further places to exploit in times of conflict, and vulnerabilities that can possibly be, enable them to have advantages or to prevent us from gaining advantage. And if that means, threatening some homeland activities and infrastructure just to show that they can, I mean, that's something that creates a psychological impact as well as a constructive economic impact. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to shoot and kill stuff, although they definitely reserve the right and have the means to do so. But they just want to have the means to have the escalation dominance ability if they decide to do so, and for a deterrent role as well. So they have a proactive deterrent mindset where if they see a need they can take something out or down for a little while, then and that will achieve their aim, then they reserve the right to do that. So I think this is all part of that same strategic viewpoint, and I think it's something worth watching.
So let's get to something that we really do know, and that's what you, Chris, think about the Space Force's deterrence strategy. You recently wrote a piece in the Space Review. What's sticking in your craw?
Well, I'm going to start with the positive stuff so that people don't think I'm Mr. Negative. But so as I mentioned earlier, there have been some really good rhetorical changes with the current administration's discussion of the Space Force and U.S. Space Command and having a combat ready force as the Chief of Space Operations likes to say. Hearing the Secretary of the Air Force speak about the need for hard kill and soft kill capabilities and not just resiliency and proliferated constellations and all the same essential buzzwords we've been hearing for the last decade plus. I think that was good. The confusing thing is while the service and the combatant command are pursuing, or at least trying to pursue, the capabilities we need to be able to match or surpass what the Chinese have been working on deploying and testing per open source documents such as the ODNI's Worldwide Threat Assessment that's published every year, is the fact that when you have the senior policy leaders in the White House and in the Department of Defense giving public addresses that basically gives a mixed message, that's not very helpful from a deterrence standpoint. And with phrases like we hope that these things will deter, or peaceful coexistence is the goal. And just like everything has always been in air, land, and sea, which there's just so many historical inaccuracies in a lot of these speeches that have come out of the space symposium last month, that I wrote that it's really great to have a positive view of the future, but it's very important to understand the adversarial viewpoint and not just expect them to think the way you do. And it's mirror imaging, and assuming that is pretty dangerous. And as a result of that, I wrote the article that basically went through a few of the comments that, if we're really going to try for the stuff that the Secretary of the Air Force and the CSO are pushing for, which I agree they need, having a policy leader from the Pentagon and others basically speak of space as an enabler only and talk about hope and things instead of concrete warfighting capabilities that can actively deter or prevail in a conflict, space, to space, from space, things of that sort. And also given the new additions that have created consternation in the building, meaning the Pentagon, that a defense policy board had been convened a few months ago to discuss, such as the space to ground fractional orbital bombardment with a hypersonic glide vehicle, and the ground to space ASATs, and then other fun stuff they're doing with co-orbitals, and as I mentioned, the system destruction, where they'll use cyber and other multi-layered things to treat proliferated LEO constellations as one target instead of many, which kind of defeats the purpose of why we were pursuing those in the first place. I think all of that, it would have been great, a lot better if the policy leaders would match with what the services are doing, because obviously they can't go beyond what the policy restraints give them. And if that happens, that's gonna not help us get where we need to go. So that's why I essentially wrote what I did, to remind people of there's a reality that has to be faced here. And I think the SecF and the CSO seem to understand that, and I just hope that OSD and the White House will hop on board.
Well, what is that reality? I mean, Brendan, when we think about deterrence, what would deter China in space? What would stick in their mind and say, right, okay, here's a red line, and that's just not a place we should go?
It's a great question. And if I had an answer to it, I'd go to Wall Street and make $1 million on it. I think the answer is that the Chinese see what we are able to do in space from a military point of view and from an economic point of view, right? When bullets are not flying, space gets you a lot of good stuff, a lot of goodness. And that's why they are the number 2 space power and are full steam ahead, because they want, when there's no conflict, they want part of that, however many trillions. And we can argue, the Europeans think it's one number, we think it's another number, the Chinese think it's who cares? It's a lot of money that's going to be made over the coming decades in space, and the Chinese want a big part of that. The other thing is that, should China go to war with or have a conflict with anybody other than the United States, they will be able to make use of all the cool toys that we've been able to and have been so successful against all of our other adversaries that we've done, right? And so that's exactly what they're looking for. I think at this point, the Chinese believe that we are still more dependent on space to fight in their backyard than they are. And that's what makes me nervous. And that's what, God forbid, we need to avoid a conflict at all costs, hopefully. Not at all costs, but we need to try to avoid a conflict as much as possible. But when it comes down to it, the Biden administration has made a big shift from the early days to current days to Chris's point, not enough, and not a universal shift. But, and again, speaking not as a representative of CASI, the United States Air Force, U.S. government right here, personal opinion only. But they've done a good job, and we need to continue that way, because the Chinese absolutely are thinking about war in space. They're thinking about conflict. They're thinking kinetic, non-kinetic, cyber, all the means you can think of, and they're developing equal measures and countermeasures to everything that we have, and are probably going at it more aggressively than we are at this point. So that's what we're facing.
Well, let me just follow with that, Brendan. You've been watching and researching and writing about China for years. You've been a student there in Shanghai. And the China Aerospace Studies Institute recently published a thorough paper on China-Russia space cooperation. Is China developing warfighting capabilities because it believes that war in space is something that will happen? And I mean this from the Chinese perspective. I mean, what do they actually think in their heads?
Yep. Yes. The answer is yes. They absolutely think that war in space at some point is inevitable. Maybe not the next conflict, right? But, they see it as no different to any other domain. Air, land, sea, and space, they also see, for their point of view, information as a separate domain that is equal to those other ones. And we can get into that, and that's the purview, again, of the SSF. But they absolutely think that conflict in space is inevitable, and they are planning both offense and defense for that, and using all means at their disposal, right? And that's why they're very heavily invested in some high tech things that we wouldn't have thought about investing in 10, 15 years ago, because we didn't have a peer adversary in space.
Yeah, I'll mention that with one of those examples is the now former deputy of the Central Military Commission that said that, war in space is inevitable. It's a historical certainty, and we cannot go backwards from that. That's not just a standard, person writing an article. That's a pretty big guy. And I'm not sure if he's retired now or if he's moved up. I haven't seen his name in a while, but I think that's something that we should be, paying close attention to. And having speeches or policy statements that come out and basically say that, we both think the same thing, that, war in space is not inevitable, which is one of the things that was in the speech, that war in space with China is not inevitable. That's good. It's good to say we don't want war in space. That's one thing. But to say it's not and have your adversary, their words, say that it is, and see the ODNI's worldwide threat assessment, which has also been improving, I might add, sharing a little bit more every year about some of the stuff that they're testing and deploying. And as Brendan mentioned, that includes everything from kinetic interceptors, ground-based lasers, high-powered microwaves, orbital ASATs, and as I mentioned earlier, some space-to-ground munitions that could be either conventional or nuclear. So they're not playing for second fiddle. They're definitely wanting to be the top dog. They're not a status quo power. They're a revisionist power, is the phrase that we like to use. And so as a result, I think it's something definitely that should be taken seriously. And I think that mixed signals doesn't really help a whole lot.
But Chris, I hate to jump in.
I'll just give a shameless plug here. We've got Kristen Burke is working on a year-long study for Chinese counterspace. So that'll be done hopefully late fall, maybe November. But looking at this very specific topic, because it is so important, because they've come so far, and because we need to do a better job corporately here in the United States thinking about these challenges.
I love shameless plugs. And Chris, you're not off the hook. Listen, I think it was the CSO who said that war in space with China is not inevitable, and that it's avoidable, and that. But the thing is, and this is probably was a counter to what the Chinese had said, that it is that's a historical, inevitability. Well, what should the CSO have done instead, do you think?
Well, it was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy that stated
sorry, I
that.
got that
no,
wrong.
No, it's okay.
Because I just think I know I heard it, and I just can't remember where. I'm sorry, everybody.
No worries. Yeah, there's so many people talking, so sometimes it's hard to keep track of everybody. But what I thought would have been a great opportunity is to say, this is what Chinese think. This is what we, the United States, think in return. And similar to what the chief of space operations has said, while we don't want to see that happen, and I might add as a side note, the deputy or the vice CSO, General Thompson, has said that we're under attack essentially every day on the low threshold level. So the whole idea about warfare is happening. War in the sense of
An
a
act of
state on state
Congress.
conflict. Yeah, a
Yeah.
state on state conflict. Okay, we can have that discussion about how do you define if you're really at war or not. But as someone who's been an operator on the back end of a computer screen watching stuff, and a policy guy, to me, if you're being hit every day by various things on the low threshold, and you're saying that, oh, this is not like it's a future problem, that doesn't send a good signal that you're taking it seriously. And from the last 15 years or so, a lot of times when things do happen, we have a tendency to miss the opportunity to say we won't tolerate this, and we will be prepared, and we will do the following if you do this. It's the usual deterrence back and forth, but instead we send out these press releases that say, they're there, you bad behaving person. It just seems very odd when this would be a better opportunity for them to say to Congress, hey, this is why we have a space command and a space force. This is why we need the ability to counter this. And just saying that we can. And another thing that he said was that I've had a problem with is we're going to be able to take hits. Well, if you're taking hits, you're not deterring anything. And the whole idea of a defense system or a deterrent is to prevent from taking hits in the first place. And because of the integrated nature of space into everything, and how important it is from a psychological, economic, military standpoint, the Chinese have a good set of options with which how to deal with that. So I just don't think that kind of discussion helps. And I think it would be better to say, this is why we have a Space Force, is to counter this kind of thing. They believe that this is inevitable, therefore we should prepare for it and deter it from happening in the first place, rather than saying this is not going to happen, because you can't say that. And you can't say that people have peacefully coexisted on air, land, and sea for centuries, because that's not true either. We have a navy because people don't get along on the oceans and people try to cause problems with sea lines of communication. People have had quarrels for over land, so we have armies. And then, of course, air has been a key approach to all the above. So I think whoever writes the next speech should consider some of these historical facts before they put them into a speech that sounds a little too Pollyannish, if you will, and uses it more as a tool of deterrence rather than who knows. But I just think it could have been much better, and I think it was a missed opportunity, and it might have even harmed our strategic communication, at least in the short term.
And now back to the shameless plug. Brendan, just to get to your organization's recent report, I wanted to dig in. The recent report was on the strategic relationship that's forming between Russia and China in the space domain. And I was just sort of thinking, I can understand why Russia, with its struggling economy and a withering space program, wants a closer relationship with China's economy and its space programs. I mean, they do have a space station, a national space station on orbit that is growing. But what does China get out of it?
Well, so we need to remember that China has only recently kind of become the big brother in that relationship. The Russians, for all the problems that they suffered post 91, have maintained a fairly strong, robust space capability. Let's be honest, the only way Americans were getting to the space station were on Russian rockets, right?
True, but those rockets now spring leaks.
True, right? So I said it's only been recently, so there has been a change, but so Russia has maintained, especially in technology, especially in rockets, and also kind of goes to aerospace engines and things like that. There are some places where the Russian technical capability is still on par with the leaders of the world. China, like I said, overall has kind of become the big brother in that relationship, but there is still absolutely a give and take. The other thing that China gets out of it is somebody else of like mind. Right. So when the U.S. comes out and says, hey, we're going to do these Artemis Accords and we want people to sign up for it, and the Chinese like, ooh, I don't like that because that's going to infringe on what I want to do. They look around and they need somebody to kind of back them up. And Russia, for geostrategic reasons, is a perfect partner for that. So, again, it's not a long deep, loving relationship like we have with the Brits or the Aussies, or
And the
anything like that.
Kiwis.
Yeah.
And
Anybody
we
Kiwi?
can and who are those folks at the north? But anyway.
Yeah, exactly. So, so it's not that kind of a deep relationship, but it is one of strategic overlap. It is one of converging strategic interests, and they are still both getting stuff out of it, be it technical or access, or just like I said, international support for a different way of looking at things.
I think I'll just throw in something here, Laura. I have a theory. I haven't looked into it, so it may be totally wrong. But one of the things that a lot of authors over the years have talked about with regard to China and, let's say, North Korea, is that the only reason why they support North Korea is it gives us, the United States, something to be distracted by while they're off pursuing their strategic objectives to displace the United States and become the top dog. Adding the Russians and the Iranians to the mix, where you have someone keeping things active and interesting in the Middle East, another one keeping things active and interesting in Europe, while the Chinese, just provide information sharing, like their joint space situational awareness cooperative agreement, where pretty much China is providing probably the most of the information, because of a lot of the Russian satellites have not been all that great, although they're trying to build more, but the Chinese have been launching way more of those kinds of systems than the Russians. And then, so I would just say that I think that's a possibility too, that they're leveraging it as a strategic thing, because they know we have equities everywhere, and they're working on trying to find a way to, maybe the Sun Tzu death by a thousand cuts kind of thing. We'll see. But that's just a thought that popped in my head while you guys were discussing that. And then the other thing is, I would say, they need money. So, and the Chinese being the second, still, I think they're still the second largest economy, even though they're somewhat plateauing, or people have been saying that for the last couple of years. They still have the ability to influence nations all over the place with Belt and Road and other things, which is now encircling and even coming into the Western Hemisphere. So I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of this activity is because they see a strategic benefit. Otherwise, they wouldn't be going back to the people that they leaned away from toward us in the early 70s.
Now, as it's May, it would be kind of good to take a look back to a year ago when it was reported that China was looking for a way to turn SpaceX's Starlink satellites into, well, orbiting paperweights with a systems attack, right? It's ostensibly unnerved by how Ukraine has used the Starlink system in its effort to kick Russia off its territory. And the thinking is Taiwan could also have access to Starlink to resist a Chinese invasion. But China is also looking to deploy its own version of Starlink. And recently, Blaine Curcio in SpaceRef reported that China's central leading group for inspection work, which manages party discipline for the Chinese Communist Party, is investigating the very companies that are working on China's version of Starlink. And those companies are, just for the record, China Satellite Networks Limited, along with China Electronics and Technology Corporation, and the China Electronics Corporation. They are also all large and all state owned. And in the report, Curcio says the inspection announcement, the report that says why they're actually going there to, quote unquote, inspect, that the focus, quote, the focus of the visit is to report and reflect on violations of political discipline, organizational discipline, integrity discipline, mass discipline, work discipline, and life discipline. Allegedly, there's even a hotline for employees to call if they want to report such discipline violations. Gentlemen, what is going on here? What does this say to you? And what's the message being transmitted here?
Well, to me, it's just part of Xi Jinping exercising his role as general secretary to make sure that everyone is well aware that the party is the lead, right? So whether you are commercial, whether you are academic, or part of the government, he is using all levers available to him to reinforce the role of the party and the influence of the party, and that's going to continue to be, like I said, both in the commercial realm as well as in the government realm. And so, I don't know what the
this
specific...
actually, this has feelings of like the Cultural Revolution, like, report on your bosses and coworkers that they don't have, well, life discipline maybe.
Well, part of it is also, probably linked to the anti-corruption drive, right? And I tell people that Xi Jinping, in his heart of hearts, is a true red communist, and he thinks that the Communist Party is the way, the truth, and the light. It is the way that the Chinese people reach the Chinese dream, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese people to become the center of the world stage, right? And at the end of the day, he wants the party to be clean and strong enough to be able to lead the Chinese people. So that's his. I'm not saying I agree with it, but that's his view of life, right? And so this is very well tied to that. That these SOEs or the management there wasn't performing up to spec or had some sort of issue, wasn't doing what they were supposed to. Who knows what the real reason behind it is, but it is simply another demonstration of we're the party, we will lead you, and you will do what we say. It's very much, kind of like the Jack Ma. Jack Ma spoke out of turn. They canceled the IPO, and then he kind of, went into a forced vacation for several months. And meanwhile, they broke apart Ant Group. So I suspect this is something very similarly related to that, without diving too deep into the details. But that's my overall suspicion.
Yeah, and I'll also add that this is something that as Brendan mentioned is not necessarily a new thing. In fact, I remember several years ago, one of the old China hands, as they called themselves, would talk about how that a lot of these corporations, if not all of them, have a red phone that goes straight to their party boss, and if a CEO of sorts gets a little too big for himself or gets a little too influential or a little too powerful, then they will call him and either pull him back in line or replace him with somebody else. And so there's been a lot of that in the space world over the last couple of years, not just these organizations, but I know that the article mentioned something about they think this is a politically important project, and it probably is. But like Brendan was saying, this is something that they do all the time. And I was looking around trying to find my Governance of China by Xi Jinping book, because one of the things that he says, and a lot of it is, that was one of his main goals coming in, is to clean the party up, like Brendan said, of the corruption, which in many ways, a lot of people just say that's just a reason to push people out who are threatening his power base. And since he sort of consolidated his power as sort of like the new Mao in some people's views, that, I'm not really surprised by this, but it's definitely something to continue watching and understanding that, this is not abnormal necessarily for the Xi Jinping China.
Gentlemen, we've run out of time. Thank you so much for coming back on the Downlink.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, this has been great. Hopefully it won't be quite as long next time because, as you know, it's a rapidly changing space. So, let's do this again soon.
That's it for this week. If you like what you're hearing, follow the Downlink on Twitter and subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast platform. For the latest defense news and analysis, listen to the Daily Defense and Aerospace Report podcast hosted by Vago Muradian, and listen to Cavis Ships to hear the latest on what's happening in the maritime domain. I'm Laura Winter, and thank you for listening.